I used to make the same mistake almost everyone makes without even thinking about it. Every spring, I walked through my garden pulling out every weed I could find, and I felt proud when the soil looked clean. The strange part is that I was throwing away some of the healthiest food growing on my own land while spending money at the grocery store for vegetables that had traveled hundreds of miles. Nobody told me that some of those so-called weeds had fed families long before supermarkets existed, and that many of them were more nutritious than the crops I was carefully protecting. If you have been doing the same thing for years, then don't feel bad, because most of us were taught that anything growing where we did not plant it must be useless or even dangerous. That simple belief has cost people a free source of fresh food for generations. I want to show you another way because once you start looking at your yard differently, you may never see weeds the same way again. I am not talking about eating random plants without knowing what they are because that would never be a smart idea. I am talking about a handful of common edible wild plants that many people already have, growing around their homes and gardens without realizing their value. Years ago, an older man showed me something while we were walking along the edge of an old vegetable patch. He bent down, picked a few leaves from a plant I had always pulled out, and smiled before telling me that during hard times, this little weed had helped keep many families fed. That simple moment stayed with me because it completely changed the way I looked at my own garden. Since then, I have saved money, grown less dependent on the store, and learned that nature often gives us useful things without asking for anything in return. Most people never notice these plants because they are too busy trying to remove them as quickly as possible. The first plant I want to share is probably growing somewhere near you right now, and almost everyone keeps making the very same mistake with it without realizing what they are losing every single season. Dot. The plant I am talking about is dandelion, and I know that surprises some people because most homeowners spend time and money trying to get rid of it every single year. I did exactly the same thing for a long time, until an older neighbor asked me why I was destroying perfectly good food. At first I laughed because I thought he was joking, but then he picked a few young leaves, showed me how to wash them, and explained that the secret was collecting them early while they were still tender. The older leaves can become bitter, and that is where many people make their first mistake. They try one large mature leaf and decide the whole plant is unpleasant. When you gather the younger leaves in spring, they have a much milder taste and they work well in fresh salads mixed with lettuce or lightly cooked with eggs. The flowers can also be used in simple recipes, and even the roots have been used for generations after being cleaned, dried, and roasted. I am not saying this replaces everything you buy from the store, but it reminds us that valuable food has been growing around us all along. Of course, there is one important rule that I always follow, and I hope you will too. Never collect any wild plant from places that may have been sprayed with herbicides or pesticides, or from roadsides where pollution can be a problem. I only gather plants from areas that I know have been left clean for years. That simple habit gives me peace of mind every time. What amazes me most is that people often spend money buying expensive greens with impressive labels while walking past healthy edible plants every single day without giving them a second look. It makes me wonder how much old knowledge quietly disappeared as life became more convenient. My grandfather never looked at a dandelion as a weed because he remembered times when wasting food simply was not an option. That lesson has stayed with me ever since. And every spring I still smile when I see those bright yellow flowers instead of reaching for a shovel. But dandelion is only the beginning, because the next plant fooled me for even longer. And once I discovered how useful it really was, I could hardly believe I had spent so many years pulling it out of my vegetable beds without thinking twice. The next plant changed the way I looked at the edges of my garden because for years I thought it was just another stubborn weed that refused to disappear. I am talking about purslane. You may have seen it spreading close to the ground with thick, smooth leaves and reddish stems, and perhaps you have pulled it out more times than you can remember. I certainly did. Then one afternoon, an old gardener stopped me before I filled another bucket with weeds. He picked up a small handful of purslane and said that people in many parts of the world actually grow this plant on purpose. I remember standing there wondering why anyone would plant something I had spent years trying to remove. When I finally tasted the young stems and leaves, I understood what he meant. They had a fresh, slightly lemon-like flavor with a pleasant, crisp texture that worked beautifully in simple salads or mixed with tomatoes and cucumbers from the garden. Sometimes I would add a handful near the end of cooking soups or vegetables because it kept its texture surprisingly well. The wonderful thing about purslane is that it asks for almost nothing. It grows during hot, dry weather when many other greens begin to struggle, and that makes it even more valuable. While expensive vegetables sometimes need constant watering and attention, this little plant quietly keeps growing without asking for much in return. That is one reason older generations respected it so much. They understood that dependable food was just as important as fancy food. Still, there is one mistake that many people make. They wait until the plant becomes old and woody before harvesting it. I always collect the younger, tender growth because that is when it tastes its best and keeps a pleasant texture. As always, I never gather it from places where chemicals may have been used because clean growing conditions matter just as much as knowing the plant itself. Over the years, I have noticed something interesting. Once people stop seeing purslane as an enemy, they begin noticing it everywhere. It almost feels as if nature has been quietly offering free food all along while we kept walking past it. That realization alone is worth remembering because it changes the way you see your own yard. But there is another wild plant that many people fear because of its sting, and I completely understand why. I avoided it for years myself until someone showed me the simple old method that removes the sting completely and turns one of the most misunderstood weeds into one of the most useful plants you can gather. Dot. For a long time, I believed stinging nettle was nothing more than a painful plant that deserved to be removed from every corner of the garden. Every time I brushed against it while pulling weeds, I ended up with burning hands, and I could not imagine why anyone would ever want to keep it. Then one spring, an older friend invited me into his garden, and I noticed an entire patch of nettles growing untouched behind his shed. I asked him why he had not cut them down, and he simply smiled before putting on a pair of gloves and gathering a basket full of young shoots. That afternoon, he showed me something I have never forgotten. He rinsed the leaves well and dropped them into boiling water for just a couple of minutes. When they came out, the sting was completely gone. That was the moment I realized how many years I had spent fighting a plant that people had respected for generations. The young leaves can be added to soups mixed into omelets or cooked just like spinach. The key is always to harvest the young tender growth before the plants become tall and tough because that is when they taste their best. I never collect old leaves late in the season because they become less enjoyable, and older gardeners always told me that the younger plants were the ones worth bringing home. Of course, I only gather nettles from clean places where I know no chemicals have been sprayed, because that simple rule applies to every edible wild plant. It takes only a few extra minutes to choose a safe location, and it is never worth taking chances. What I appreciate most about nettles is not only that they provide free food, but that they remind me of a different way of thinking. Instead of asking what I need to buy, I first look at what nature is already offering. That small change has saved me money year after year, and it has made me pay much closer attention to the land around me. Most people walk past nettles without ever realizing they could become part of a healthy meal with almost no cost at all. That is exactly why old knowledge matters, because once it disappears, we often replace it with expensive solutions we never really needed. But there is another common plant that many gardeners keep pulling out every spring. Even though it grows quietly in lawns, flower beds, and vegetable gardens, and its soft green leaves have been welcomed onto dinner tables for generations. Another plant that deserves far more respect is chickweed. If you have ever worked in a vegetable garden early in the season, you have probably seen it spreading across the soil like a soft green carpet. Most people grab it by the handful and throw it into a compost pile without giving it another thought. I used to do exactly the same thing until an elderly woman at a local garden market told me she actually hoped chickweed would appear every spring. She explained that she picked the young plants before they became too large and used them fresh in salads, or added them to sandwiches because they had a mild, clean taste that blended well with other greens. I decided to try it for myself, and I was surprised by how gentle the flavor was. It did not overpower the meal, and it reminded me that some of the simplest foods are often the ones we overlook. The biggest mistake people make with chickweed is waiting too long before harvesting it. Once it begins flowering heavily and getting older, it becomes less tender and far less enjoyable. I always look for the fresh young growth because that is what experienced gardeners taught me many years ago. I also make sure the plants come from areas that have never been treated with weed killers or other chemicals because safety always comes before convenience. One habit I have developed over the years is walking slowly through my garden instead of rushing to clean everything up. That slower pace allows me to notice which wild plants are growing well and which ones are worth keeping for a little while before I decide what truly needs to be removed. It is amazing how different your garden looks once you stop thinking that every volunteer plant is your enemy. Nature has its own way of offering small gifts if we are willing to recognize them. I have saved money many times simply by gathering a few edible greens that appeared on their own, instead of buying another bag from the store. More importantly, I feel connected to the way older generations lived because they learned to recognize useful plants instead of fighting every one of them. They understood that knowing your land was just as valuable as owning it. There is one final plant I want to tell you about because it taught me perhaps the most important lesson of all. It is so common that almost everyone has seen it, yet very few people realize how it quietly reminds us that the best solutions are often the simplest ones waiting right beneath our feet. The last plant I want to share with you is broadleaf plantain. Almost everyone has stepped on it thousands of times without giving it a second look. It grows along garden paths and backyards and even between cracks where other plants struggle to survive. For years, I thought it was just another weed that made the lawn look untidy. Then an old gardener asked me a simple question that stayed with me. He said if this plant keeps returning year after year without anyone planting it, maybe nature is trying to tell us something. That made me curious enough to learn more. I discovered that the young tender leaves could be gathered in spring before they became tough and stringy. Those young leaves have a mild flavor and can be mixed with other greens or cooked gently in soups and simple vegetable dishes. The older leaves become much firmer, so I leave those alone and wait for fresh growth instead. That is another lesson older gardeners passed down because they understood that timing is often more important than the plant itself. Most people think edible wild plants are only useful during difficult times, but I see them differently. I see them as a way to waste less and appreciate more. Every season, my garden reminds me that not everything valuable arrives in a seed packet or comes with a price tag. Some of the best things simply appear when the conditions are right. Of course, I never rely only on wild plants, and I never encourage anyone to eat a plant unless they are completely certain of its identification. If there is any doubt at all, I leave it where it is because no free meal is worth taking unnecessary risks. That simple rule has guided me for many years, and I hope it stays with you as well. What has changed most is not only what I gather, but how I think. I no longer rush through the garden trying to remove every unexpected plant as quickly as possible. Instead, I slow down and ask myself whether this visitor might actually have a purpose before I pull it out. More often than not, I discover something useful that I would have missed in the past. That small change in attitude has made gardening feel less like a battle and more like a partnership with nature. And there is one final idea that ties all of these plants together. Because once you understand it, you will never walk through your garden in quite the same way again. The biggest lesson these wild plants have given me has very little to do with weeds and everything to do with the way we choose to see the world around us. I still grow my tomatoes, my beans, my peppers, and all the vegetables my family enjoys, but now I also leave room for a little curiosity. Instead of rushing to pull every unfamiliar plant from the ground, I stop for a moment and ask whether it might have served people long before I was born. That simple question has changed my garden more than any expensive fertilizer or new tool ever could. It has saved me money every season because some of the healthiest greens I bring into my kitchen appear without planting a single seed. It has also made gardening feel calmer because I no longer believe that every wild plant is fighting against me. Some are unwanted and should certainly be removed, but others have quietly earned their place through generations of practical use. The real value is not only the food itself, but the confidence that comes from knowing your own land a little better every year. I hope that after watching this, you will walk through your own garden a little more slowly. You may notice a dandelion growing beside the fence, a patch of purslane between your vegetables, a few young nettles near the compost pile, or chickweed and plantain, where you once saw nothing but weeds. Of course, always make absolutely certain that any wild plant is correctly identified before eating it, and only harvest from clean areas that have never been treated with chemicals. That one habit protects both your health and your peace of mind. If even one of these plants becomes a useful addition to your kitchen, then your garden has already given you something valuable completely free of charge. Old gardeners understood that nature often provides more than we expect if we simply learn to recognize it. I believe that lesson is just as important today as it was many years ago. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope the next time you reach for a weed, you will pause for just a second, because the plant in your hand might not be a problem at all. And once you begin looking at your garden this way, you may discover that the greatest harvest was quietly growing there long before you ever planted your first vegetable.